China Miéville, Keanu Reeves. How did we get here? Yet, here we are with the Book of Elsewhere. Alright, so today I want to talk about the Book of Elsewhere by Keanu Reeves and China Miéville. But don't be fooled by the cover. They have Keanu Reeves' name at the top, but I'm fairly sure he didn't write much of this, if any of it. For my fellow China Miéville fans who've read things like the Sprawl trilogy, you aren't really going to find that here. And it's a shame because I think Miéville hasn't written a novel of his own since 2014. And I think he's got another one cooking though, so we'll probably see more of him in the future, which is great. And maybe this is exactly the sort of project Miéville needed to sort of jumpstart his creativity and, bring us the next great weird fiction masterpiece. We can only hope. But what is this really? Because I was trying to work it out even before I read it. Is this sort of genre pulp fiction? Should we approach it as something more literary? Genre literary sort of fiction? Is it really trying to be something other than a sort of a commercial cash-in? Has it got some meaning in it? And ultimately I think the answer is probably yes to all those questions. You may already be familiar with the BRZRKR comics, which sort of star a very Keanu Reeves looking protagonist in the artwork, and Reeves was involved in sort of planning the story for this world. And it's fast becoming his kind of expanded universe sort of baby. And will we see a BRZRKR film one day? Maybe, depending if Reeves has still got the star power to get it done. I'm sure I'm sure that's the ultimate goal. So the main character here, B, or Unute, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, but he is a sort of a timeless, ageless, immortal, and a man who was born from time immemorial. Blue lightning flashes from his eyes when he goes into this sort of berserker mode, and we sort of catch up to him in this narrative which is in the present day, roughly, where a team of sort of American military officers and staff accompanying him into battle and using him without really using him because they can't give him an order. They just, it's a bit of a facade because he wouldn't have to follow it. But the plot itself is very meandering. Like, I know a lot of people struggle with this book, particularly in the first 100 pages or so. And you can understand why, because it sort of shifts, it jumps in between the main present time to these sort of more lyrical explorations of B's past at all these different points in history. But what I really want to talk about is not the plot, because this isn't really a book about the plot. If you're reading for plot points and narrative in sort of a genre fiction kind of a way, you probably won't enjoy this as much. Like, this is a book that is all about the themes. And for me, the themes all come down to what B represents, which is the death drive. And by death drive, I mean the Freudian death drive, thanatos. And that's where I'm worried that a lot of people will get lost very early on in this, because I think the second chapter is called The Doctor's Story, and Freud isn't named, but it's presented as a sort of a Freudian case study that Freud wrote at the end of his life and threw into the fire. And the metafictional idea here is that Freud actually encountered B as a patient several times throughout his life, and one pivotal time was the inspiration for Freud to make his move beyond the pleasure principle towards the death drive, which happened from memory around 1920. And I should give some context here, because not everyone would be familiar with this transition in Freud's thought from the pleasure principle to the death drive. But in short, earlier in his career, Freud thought that the thing that really motivates humans is our yearning, our desire for pleasure. And this could explain so many aspects of our human nature. But the pleasure principle was never quite enough to explain, aspects of human nature that seem to enjoy our own suffering, or even things like suicide and self-harm. And perhaps above all, our everyday inclination to sabotage ourselves and even find enjoyment in that self-sabotage. So this is why Freud moved towards an idea of thanatos and eros, the death drive and the life drive, as being this sort of integral opposition and contradiction within human beings. And this was roughly 1920, I think, when Beyond the Pleasure Principle was first published. And so what we find early on in this chapter is that the inspiration for Freud to make this transition was actually his sessions with Unit, with B. At a time when B would say, he doesn't want to die. And this is the Freud at the end of his life, having fled Austria in the wake of the Nazis' invasion and found his way to England, and he's sort of reflecting on his career. He sort of sees B in terms of being a shell shock victim, and Freud worked with for many years early in his career. But what he assumes at first is this sort of fantasy of Unit talking about his immortality. He realizes at some point it's actually true, and that Unit doesn't want to die, but he wants to be able to die. That's the fundamental distinction. And this inspires Freud's understanding of the death drive for the first time. So all that I find really fascinating because I love Freud, and I think all those ideas are incredible to think about, and great fodder for fiction as well. We always have to remember that Freud's ideas have been hugely influential in storytelling and what they've uncovered about previous storytelling. Whatever you think about the validity of Freud's theories and current, psychoanalytic practice, his influence on the history of storytelling and fiction has been really profound and continues to be. So most readers wouldn't really get a lot from that chapter, but I fell in love with it. And so much so that the chapters that came after, with this military setup and being in the present day, was a little bit flat for those first 100 pages or so. And there's this real sense of dislocation as we begin jumping around to different timelines and perspectives on B. But I think it's a sort of novel you really have to go with what it's trying to do to get the enjoyment out of it. And there is enjoyment to be had, especially during the chapters which are sort of interludes between the present plot, where we get a perspective of B from different characters he's encountered along the way. So another memorable chapter is we get a sense of what B was like, from roughly the 1700s, when he's white in the wife story, and he did have a wife for a time, and they had this sort of sprawling love story. Sorry to use that pun, but ultimately I think it all comes back to that central theme of immortality and not wanting to die, because we've seen that in so many different vampire stories, or even things like Doctor Who, that sort of desire to die as being this sort of natural thing for an immortal. But this is about wanting to be able to die, but still to not die. And by the end of the novel, spoilers I suppose, we find out that B is actually, he really is the literal manifestation of the death drive. And in this world, Eros also exists in a different form and sort of opposes him and what he represents. But B, he wants to be able to die, you feel, so he can truly live. And that's what's been denied him through his immortality. So it's really like this sort of literal metaphor of the human condition, of those opposing forces that Freud identified, the death drive and the life drive, and that contradiction. And that's sort of playing out in this eternal conflict between B, Unit, and this other character, Vane, who is the life drive. And it's in that contradiction that we have our humanity. So this is starting to become a discussion of Freud, really, more than the novel itself. But this is what it sparks for me, and I don't really want to, I'm not reviewing this to tell you whether you should read it or not. I'm just trying to unearth some of the themes here, because that's what really fascinates me personally. Because we know Freud's unearthing of the unconscious mind in the late 19th, early 20th century sparked this huge revolution. It really obliterated the notion of the self we had up until that point in a lot of culture, which was this idea of the self as unified, especially in religious terms, as a singular sort of soul that contains everything of who we are. And Freud really totally went against the status quo and undermined all that. So what we're left with is this sort of divided self. And Freud's transition from the pleasure principle to the death drive was sort of a second revolution, and probably the biggest discovery Freud made post the unconscious, that really changed, that revolutionized his own thought as well. All of which is to say, this is the sort of space within which the Book of Elsewhere exists. B is less a character and more a concept. He's the death drive personified. So I'm actually going to leave it there because I don't want to spoil it. I think you should definitely read it if these ideas are interesting to you. And, you know, the writing's great. It's not going to really satisfy hardcore Miéville fans, I don't think. But for what it is, it's definitely a worthwhile experience. And the other thing I'll say is that I'm starting to make some more video essays recently. And I have one coming up on Saturday, which is a short story by Harlan Ellison. I think you'll enjoy that. It probably goes into some Freudian things as well. And this is the sort of story that I'll keep thinking about naturally, I think, for quite a while. And I can definitely imagine making a video essay on it in the future, especially seeing what we can compare it to. I mean, that's the whole point of this channel, isn't it? Story collisions. So until next time, have a good one, take care, and see you soon. Bye.